first ever, thanks Stephanie, for our first ever panel event, which we hope to follow up with a few more. We're really excited for a more interactive format, and we look forward to the questions at the end. My name is Kristen. I'm the co-founder of the CLF Alberta Hub, and our mandate is to bring that information on embodied carbon throughout the industry and specifically try and get stories pertinent to Alberta. And I think we have a really good panel to do that today. Without further ado, I will introduce our moderator for the day, Stephanie Fargus, one of our CLF members.
Great, thank you. So I'm Stephanie. I'm an associate and a specification writer with Dialog. I have over 11 years experience specializing in specifications in high performance buildings. And I'm currently working on initiatives with Dialog as well as external clients to advocate for sustainable procurement and material transparency. Today, I am joined by Adam, and I'll pass it on to Adam.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. And hello, everyone who's joined us today for the conversation. I'm Adam Stoker, work with the City of Calgary as part of their Sustainable Infrastructure team. And among other things, I'm helping to lead the charge on understanding embodied carbon as it pertains to City of Calgary buildings. Envision what the future will be in terms of our goals in that area, and also imagine as to what the future of the broader city community looks like as we start to think about embodied carbon differently.
Amy?
Hiya, so I'm coming from Vancouver today, maybe the only one that's not living in Alberta at the moment. I work for Perkins and Will as a sustainable building advisor. My background is in structural engineering and life cycle assessment, and I currently work on designing sustainable buildings for third-party certifications and City of Vancouver and wider provincial framework.
Jolene?
Hi, everybody. Jolene McLaughlin. I'm the Director of Corporate Sustainability for EllisDon Construction, and I spend a lot of my time thinking about embodied carbon and reducing carbon emissions in our buildings that we build in support of our clients' overall goals. So looking forward to the conversation with this group today.
Stacy?
Hello, I'm Stacy Simpson. I've been with USG for about 9 years now. I've been the sustainability manager for a good 8 years now. And I work with product transparency as well as the 2030 sustainability goals and implementing the goals into USG's culture and the way we do things.
Great, thanks everyone. So for today, it will be a moderated panel discussion with industry experts that you've now met, representing the different project participants. So any questions, please direct it to the Q&A section, and Kristen will help me with moderating that through the session. And so for today, it will be split into two segments. The first segment will be representing the current state of the industry to discuss any limitations, highlight advocacy that we're all doing in our current role. And then the second half, we will discuss the future state of the industry and what opportunities we as the industry can do to influence transformational change. So ahead of that, I'm going to share my screen because we thought it would be good to provide a high-level overview of different industry-associated terms with low-carbon materials. So the first one, environmental product declarations. Those are used as a way to determine whether a product can be incorporated into a project to reduce the environmental impact category. This diagram illustrates the process that's involved in having an EPD created. And EPDs are classified into two main categories: an industry-wide generic, so something like the Canadian ready mix EPD, or a product-specific one, like a manufacturer such as Armstrong or USG for a product-specific ceiling tile EPD. And a product-specific EPD is a type 3 with a third-party certification and verification. You can think of EPDs as similar to a nutrition label where it highlights the different impact categories that that particular product possesses. And a life cycle assessment is used to document a product's life cycle in either a cradle to gate scope. So as you see, the A1 to the A3 category, starting with the resource extraction to the product leaving the factory gate before it's transported to the consumer. Another method is cradle to grave, which is the A1 to a C4 category, which starts with resource extraction and goes up to the product ending in either a landfill or a recycling plant. Embodied carbon refers to the greenhouse gas emissions, also referred to as the global warming potential, arising from the manufacturing, transportation, installation, maintenance, and disposal of different products and materials. In contrast, operational carbon refers to the greenhouse gas emissions due to building energy consumption. And finally, carbon neutral product. There currently isn't a widely accepted definition or process to define what a carbon neutral product is, or third-party certification agency or a testing procedure that a manufacturer can request. The industry is still in the early days of manufacturers providing product transparency. So just keep in mind that this is a new territory, but for today's purposes, our team has defined carbon neutral product as any CO2 released into the atmosphere from the manufacturing, which includes the raw material production, raw material transport, inputs associated with producing the product, the distribution and the usage of it, and finally, the end of life disposal of that product being offset by an equal amount of the CO2 being removed or offset. So now we will go into the first segment of the moderated panel. And I will start with you, Adam. With the Mayor of Calgary declaring a climate emergency, what is the City of Calgary doing today to better understand the embodied carbon associated with their projects?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. In terms of where we're at today, I guess there's three main things I wanted to talk about that that we're doing to better understand and to build knowledge around embodied carbon. The first is learning about the tools that we have available to us. So learning at what resources are out there to help us start to answer questions around embodied carbon. It's important for us as we think to a future state where we'll start to use these tools on a more regular basis. It's important for us today to understand what are their strengths, weaknesses, what types of questions can they answer, and what are the limitations of the tools that we have available today. I think in parallel with this work, we're also keeping our eye on different standards and codes or programs that are starting to define the methodology and the targets that projects should be thinking about or incorporating using around embodied carbon. So things like the Zero Carbon Building Standard, the LEED program, Living Building Challenge, different municipalities, within Canada and beyond, how are they approaching this topic of embodied carbon, and what can we learn from those that are kind of leading the way. And lastly, the third thing that we're doing is right now we need to learn a lot more about our own portfolio, where we're at today. And in our mind, what a great way to do that is by actually getting in there and starting to evaluate the embodied carbon of our projects. So we're now asking our major capital projects to conduct embodied carbon assessments at this stage, really to start to build that knowledge by which we can eventually come to targets and requirements and goals for our projects. But the first step really is to understand, where we're at, where those opportunities are, and start to bridge the gap where we see missing information.
And Amy, with forward-thinking clients like Adam, what are the biggest gaps in framework used to quantify embodied carbon?
So most people use EPDs within the building and construction and design industry to quantify embodied carbon. As you mentioned before, Stephanie, what an EPD is, I'm not going to go into that. But when we're talking about whole building life cycle embodied carbon, we're typically only talking about structural materials and envelope materials. We very rarely include any mechanical materials in our analysis. And the reason for that is there's very few EPDs with decent information out there for mechanical or electrical equipment, things like wires in the building or plumbing fixtures and fittings. So that's one of the gaps. The second gap is refurb projects. So there's loads of guidance out there, whether it's city, provincial guidance, whether it's guidance that comes with third-party certification framework on how to quantify the embodied carbon and reduce it for new construction. But there's very little information out there for refurb projects. You know, how do you replace the materials within your building while focusing on embodied carbon reductions? So that's something I'd love to see in the future is more guidance on that. And then I think the third thing is most EPDs have really good information on life cycle stages A1 to A3. So extraction through to the end of that manufacturing process before it's delivered to site, with very limited information, in particular in the demolition and deconstruction phase of the product's life cycle. So that's another gap that I think manufacturers need to start focusing on, is how to quantify the carbon associated with those latter phases of the material's life.
And Jolene, from a constructor's perspective, what is the capacity and ability to respond to the current demand for low carbon materials?
It's a good question. I think we're seeing an increase in interest in this area, you know, all the way since 2018. It seems to be growing pretty substantially. And clients at this point, they want to make informed decisions. They're not really content with, oh, it's going to cost you too much money, so you should just ignore that problem. They really want to understand what's the carbon impact of what they're making choices on, and then what's the cost comparison. And so we're trying to push that forward as part of the bid leveling exercise, so everybody has an open playing field to understand what's going on. I would say, similar to Amy's comments, the biggest hurdle is really lack of understanding, and then the lack of transparency data in the form of EPDs. We really need product specific EPDs in order to be able to justify making a choice for one product over another. And without those product specific examples, it's really hard to quantify it. We focus at EllisDon on the structural materials largely because that's where we have the most value in terms of offering advice and support. And so when we look at concrete, we see that industry responding. There's going to be an EPD tool available across the country that will allow the producers to provide us with product specific or mix specific EPDs. But that's still not available until later this year. And so that answer was coming there. But then on the steel side, because we're so separated from the actual mills that would create the EPDs, it's really hard for us to use the broken telephone chain of conversation to get that information communicated across. And so when the steel suppliers and the steel fabricators don't understand what we're actually asking for or why, it makes it hard to get that information. And we want to make sure that we're really getting quality information coming back to us. So then the other piece of that is just education all the way through that value chain to say, this is really important, this is why it's important, and we want to understand that better.
And Stacy, now that we've heard the owner, consultant, and contractor's perspective of the need for it, what actions as a manufacturer are you implementing to address industry requests for low carbon materials?
Thank you, Stephanie. So USG has made a commitment to the Science Based Targets Initiative to lower our carbon emissions in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. As part of this effort, USG will be implementing energy savings programs, including an actual location-based analysis for the use of on-site renewable energy, as well as implementing the use of a cost of carbon metric into our capital decisions. Tackling carbon as a company-wide effort will ultimately be seen as an embodied carbon reduction in the products that USG makes. In terms of how we're actually delivering low embodied carbon products right now, we just recently purchased renewable energy for one of our ceilings manufacturing plants. This is actually just our first step in moving towards our goal of 100% renewable electricity by 2030. In the future, we will be looking at purchase power agreements and other vehicles to complete this conversion. As we do this, we will be updating our EPDs and it will be seen in our global warming potential that we have a reduced embodied carbon. What will actually drive the progress for this is the response from our customers. Since, for an example, wallboard at this time is not really specified on sustainability properties. It's more thought of as a commodity product. So the more our customers want the EPDs, the more we will respond with EPDs.
Great, thanks everyone. Now we're going to move to the second half, which we will discuss where we're headed tomorrow. So the future state. Adam, what industry developments are you most excited about, and how do you think they will influence the design and construction in the future?
Yeah, I think what makes me excited about the future of life cycle analysis as a whole, and the conversation around embodied carbon, I really see it as a confluence of better information and more information being available. So building on points that Jolene and Stacy have mentioned, how we improve that chain of information flow to ensure that the resources we need to kind of do better database decision making kind of are at our fingertips. So I'm excited to, as manufacturers, not only get better with providing information, but also drive down their impacts as well and produce better performing products. I see that combining together with just the expertise of the practitioners working in the field. I'm excited to see where our design community can get to incorporating embodied carbon into decision making and design principles. As we've seen them do with many other aspects of sustainability. Energy modeling is a great example of how integrated that is now with the process in good sustainable building design. And I think embodied carbon, we will get to a point as our practitioners become more experienced in using this and develop their own tools to bring it into that design process, that we'll get some really fantastic results. Ultimately, where I think this is going to lead us is to a place where we're recognizing the inherent complexity in the issue of embodied carbon. It's a big, complex topic, but I think when you start getting good information combined with good practitioner knowledge, we're going to see some really interesting, very regional solutions to this answer that take into account all the considerations. So we have confidence at the end of the day the buildings we're creating strike the right balance of using the right materials in the right places at the right time to create the best buildings we can. So I'm excited for that in the future.
And Amy, in the first half, you discussed some of the gaps that you're finding in the framework, but what have been some unexpected challenges and successes in reducing embodied carbon?
So a success, I'm going to start with successes and then I'm going to move on to another challenge. I think this can apply to any architecture firm. Any architecture firm can do this, but what we've started to do at Perkins and Will is run facade comparison studies using life cycle assessment software. So we're quantifying the embodied carbon of all the different types of facade materials, whether that's a fully glazed building or an aluminium facade building or a terracotta building. And then we can bring that hard data to the client. And the reason this has been such a large success is traditionally in the past, a client would pick a building envelope or a facade material based on aesthetics and cost. And now they can weigh up the embodied carbon of each of those different choices that we're presenting to them. So it gives embodied carbon an equal footing against cost and aesthetic. And then a challenge is operational versus embodied carbon. So over the last 20 years, we've seen embodied carbon reduced significantly in the majority of buildings. Buildings that are designed for things like high performance envelopes are seeing significant reductions in energy use in the building, and with that significant reductions in operational carbon. But some of the decisions that we make to get to that low operational carbon building can negatively impact embodied carbon of the building. An example of this would be insulation. So to meet the Passive House certification framework, for example, you'd have to design a extremely high performance envelope, usually with a very thick insulation layer to reduce your operational carbon. But that increase in the insulation layer then adds more material to the building. And depending on what type of insulation you're selecting, it might significantly increase your embodied carbon. So I think operational versus embodied is going to be a real challenge in the future. And in the future, designers are going to have to start thinking about the choices, weighing the choices up against each other, rather than just this narrow lens of, oh, this reduces your embodied carbon and this reduces your operational carbon.
Jolene, what can we do now to improve response to the demand and prepare for increasing performance expectations given the need to get to net zero emissions?
I think I'm largely going to echo what Stacy already said, which is show manufacturers that there is a demand. What we know for a lot of industries is reducing the embodied carbon of the way products are manufactured is going to take capital investment to change equipment and systems, and a lot of research and development to change the processes. And so in order for a lot of companies to actually invest in those things, they need to understand that those investments are going to be rewarded. This is particularly true for the commodity space because they're so used to being drilled down on cost that anything that has the opportunity to increase their cost in any way, shape, or form means they lose a project, and so they can't afford to do that. And so we really need to show them that their investment is going to be rewarded, that there is a demand for this type of product, and that there is a competitive advantage to being first movers and getting there. The way to do that is to clearly communicate as an owner or a client, clearly communicate your desire to have a low carbon product, make sure that it's clear through all the way through the project communication chain. What we find happens a lot is the client talks to the designer, and those people involved in the early stages understand that overarching goal. But then if it doesn't get reiterated through the rest of the phases, it doesn't get picked up in costing exercises, it doesn't get picked up during tendering processes. And so it really just gets lost in the shuffle. And I would say that just putting in your specs is actually not enough. You have to be really clear that, yes, this is an important thing in the specs, and we want to see the results of that. And so through that, asking for product specific EPDs so that we can validate performance and that we can show that there is actual reductions happening on an individual product basis, and include that verification process, because that whole system then allows us to compare apples to apples comparisons, put costs to those carbon numbers, and then make accurate and informed decisions. And then again, just continuing to educate everybody across the value chain so we're all kind of on the same page and working towards the same goal.
And Stacy, with all the participants bringing up EPDs and the importance of it and the advocacy, what are the challenges and limitations with environmental product declarations?
So in addition to product reformulation and energy efficiency programs, the current available mechanism for driving down embodied carbon values is to utilize renewable energy. This is either through on-site generation or the purchase of renewable energy credits or PPA. Currently, EPDs are not transparent in the terms of the incorporation of on-site or purchased renewable energy or carbon offsets. There exists no requirement to clearly list or even mention the use of purchased renewable energy or carbon offset techniques. Basically, no overall guidelines that have been developed, so manufacturers are under no obligation to explain how these lower embodied carbon numbers are actually being achieved. The standards governing life cycle assessments and the prep of these EPDs still needs to catch up to the rapidly changing landscape of renewable energy and using carbon offsets. Another challenge is, of course, the raw material suppliers. They're very slow in providing us the data that we need to actually provide accurate models for our products. When a raw material supplier does not have this product-specific data, we are forced to use like just generic modeling, which, of course, doesn't give us accurate results. And then lastly, we need our customers to actually need EPDs. As manufacturers recognize that the availability of product-specific EPDs drives the sales, they will develop and expand the availability of these EPDs. Just taking this even one step further, we need our customers to actually need lower embodied carbon products. We need them to want it from us, and we need them to demand it from us. And then this will actually create a very healthy competition between manufacturers. I mean, what's better than to actually strive to better the environment, right? And then just adding this is that EPDs are very expensive, and we're at the point where we actually want to show our reduction in carbon emissions from our goals and what we're trying to do. So, this is going to have to be updated probably yearly going forward.
Thanks, everyone. For the attendees, I welcome you to submit Q&As. So firstly, Adam, this one's directed to you from Travis. Could you please clarify what it looks like to ask major project developments to look at embodied carbon? Are there any requirements for this?
Yeah, sure, Travis, I can happy to share a little more. So, and I would preface this by saying we're very much in the pilot phase of this. We're trying it out, and we're learning not only from the specific information that's generated from these studies, but we're also learning from the process of how we do the studies, working with our design teams and consulting teams to better understand what's happening. Generally, we're trying to align with the requirements and the methodology that's outlined in other programs that define how to look at embodied carbon or to do life cycle assessments of whole buildings as well. So we're drawing a lot from LEED just for the basic parameters, kind of rules by which you evaluate. That aligns really well with the Canada Green Buildings Council's Zero Carbon Building Standard, which also asks projects to look at embodied carbon. So we have an ulterior motive of doing it in a way such that it could align with different green building certification schemes when appropriate. But we're starting there as kind of like the best practice. And I think we're hoping to learn from the first few that we do what we might need to do differently in the city of Calgary to make it more useful for us or to get better information coming out. But those are some of our starting points.
Thanks. The next question, Stacy, I'll direct this one to you. It's from Tim. What are your thoughts on product category EPDs, example, self-leveling underlayments as a whole category, in lieu of product-specific EPDs? A single EPD can cost up to $50K.
I believe that, with the product-specific EPDs, you're going to get more data, right? It's going to be directed for that manufacturer, for that manufacturing plant. The cost, it is what it is at this time. It has decreased over time, but I've found that our customers are more interested in actually having that product specific, even going as far as plant specific data. So, I guess it is, the cost is what it is. And, we're actually working on storing products, soon to be released EPDs. So it's funny I got this question.
I think I'd like to jump in on that too, Stacy. I think, there's like you say, the cost is the cost, and yeah, it's an unfortunate consequence, but the fact that that EPD is valid for 5 years, every piece of product that you sell falls under that EPD. The issue with having industry-wide or product category kind of data is that it doesn't tell us what USG is doing to get better against USG's previous numbers. And so without those product-specific information, we can't prove that, this mix of concrete in the world that I'm spending a lot of time in is better than this mix of concrete. And beyond that, we can't prove that Lafarge is actually working to reduce their emissions. And I'm picking on Lafarge because I know they are. But we need that product specific data in order to actually quantify and give us real information, as opposed to just the checkbox that sometimes it feels like we look for right now.
And actually, I want to jump in on this too, just to maybe continue the conversation, because I think it's important to recognize that there are different ways of driving down embodied carbon. You know, some of those are tied into material selection, and I think especially in the short term, that's where we have a ton of ground to potentially make up, both by just choosing better materials out of the gate, and then encouraging through that virtuous cycle the product manufacturers to continue to improve their own products. But there's also the design world as well. So different information is useful for different things. What Jolene's describing there is certainly to push on that product selection piece is very good. But we should also recognize that different design directions, choosing to build versus one material versus another, or just like how the building is shaped, those type of things also influence embodied carbon. It's important not to ignore that. But I think the quick wins, the initial first steps, will come in the focusing on the lower embodied carbon products.
Sorry, can I also
Of course.
weigh in as well? Just from a designer's perspective as well, we tend to try and pick products with product-specific EPDs if any of our projects are going for a third-party certification. Third-party certifications like LEED or WELL give higher points to product-specific EPDs over industry-wide, and it's just a point, but at the same time, it makes our lives a lot easier if we can go for product-specific EPDs and we can guarantee the client that, LEED Gold or LEED Platinum certification that they're often asking for. So that's another incentive to do so.
The next question is directed to Stacy, but I'll open it up, and Travis, maybe you can provide a bit more context, but the question is, where would you recommend this chain most effectively start, either with developers, architects, or designers? I'm thinking maybe that's related to the push to have EPDs, if anyone on the panel wants to answer that.
Can you say that again, please? You said, where should this start? Where should the need for EPDs start?
The request
okay.
when it came up, yeah.
Okay. So I'm not sure if I'm really the person to ask about this, because I mean, it absolutely has to start with the beginning, right? With the architect or with the designer or with the building owner. It has to start there. Maybe the others on the panel can elaborate on this, but I'm the one making the data for the user. So
yeah, maybe I'll jump in and add a few thoughts there, Stacy, because I definitely think the push, the ask has to come from folks like me, developers, owners that are setting the goals or the aspirations or the priorities for the project. But I will tell you that folks like us will need a lot of help, from the world of the design community in getting that conceptual idea. We want a low embodied carbon building down into something more tangible, more measurable, asking for it in the right way. And then, folks like Jolene as well, in telling, letting us know what's possible, what's not possible, what's out there. So, as with many topics under the umbrella of sustainable design, I really think an integrated approach is needed to move things forward. But a lot of that initial push will have to come from those that ultimately want to build the better buildings, with the rest of the teams coming in to support them in getting there.
Yeah, I think I would reframe it. Instead of saying, where does it need to start? It's almost like it needs to end, kind of to Adam's point, with the owner. If the owner's not interested in the question of how much lower is this carbon option in terms of carbon, this option than this option, then there's not much ability or drive's not a fair word, but there's not much latitude to be able to push for lower carbon options. But that doesn't mean that I, as the contractor, can't go to the owner and say, hey, there's this opportunity to reduce the embodied carbon of these materials. And I've worked with Amy and a few others on her team on this before, and this is how we can push this forward on a project. And similarly, it's the same way for the architects and the designers. I would say, Stacy, it's probably a bit hard from your end, because by the time we get to you, we've made a whole bunch of decisions, but we can't push this climate solving problem onto one individual entity. It's got to be all of us working together to figure out how we do it. So wherever it starts, it doesn't really matter, but the clients have to be bought into it.
Okay, so the next question, I'll open it up to the panel. Does the category-based EPD or industry-wide not determine the real movers and shakers who are doing most of the work in reducing embodied carbon by elevating those who are not doing as much?
I can start. So I would say it has the risk of doing that. Without the product specific, there's no nothing to hold people accountable to, right? And so if you're hiding under the guise of an industry average number to say, well, the whole industry's here, that's not really pushing you to do better, and it's not really informing what you're doing individually. And so that's the benefit of the product specific EPDs. And Phil Bowie from Exact Technology just mentioned, showcasing how well a product performs. That really is the key to those product specific EPDs. And I would even say, just how is it performing against what it was last year or 5 years ago when we did the EPD cycle, however you want to look at it.
I also think the industry-wide EPDs, the one benefit of them is they could almost be used as a baseline. So then you're seeking out product-specific EPDs to compare to the industry-wide number. And then that would encourage you to use the product-specific EPDs if certain manufacturers or suppliers are going above and beyond the industry average, holding them more accountable.
And I think that the guidelines out there that are talking about how to measure this and how to represent, when you're doing better than a typical building, I think they're pretty good about, it tends to be they're awarding projects or recognizing projects that can show an improvement over that baseline that Amy was talking about. So anyone that's just in the mix as the industry standard, well, they're not contributing anything towards that improvement over the baseline. It's only those that have their product specific EPDs and can show that they're doing better than the industry average, those that can move us in the right direction from a material perspective.
So for the next question from Wissam, I'm going to ask both Jolene and Amy this question. What percentage of owners do you see today asking for lower embodied carbon and willing to put the additional costs versus owners focused strictly on cost?
I wouldn't be able to give you an exact percentage. I think it's my job to advocate for reducing embodied carbon on the project. So we usually have a visioning exercise with our clients, and we provide them information on, all of these things that they can do with their buildings to make them more sustainable. And some clients are really want to reduce their whole life cycle carbon, operational and embodied. And those are, the clients where then we begin this stage of working together to reduce embodied carbon that doesn't necessarily have to come with a high cost. There are ways to do it that don't have to increase the cost. And those are the solutions that we're trying to work towards together. If we can't find a solution that doesn't increase cost, then there's an exercise of compromise. How much more are they willing to spend to reduce the embodied carbon? Often, if a client is trying to pursue a third-party certification like the zero carbon standard that's been put together by the CAGBC, then they'll have a more of an incentive to spend more money on reducing embodied carbon. So every client is different. I wouldn't be able to give you a percentage. There's just so many different scenarios.
Yeah, I would say, unfortunately, it's still the vast majority that are looking at cost, but I think we've been so conditioned in society as a whole to just consider costs that we don't realize that we can ask this question as well. It's just been very recently that I've even realized that going out to the market and saying, hey, show us what you can do, what it's going to cost, and what you can really do, and how much that cost difference is. We've had a few anecdotal conversations with a number of REITs and a few other clients who have said, no, we're interested in seeing this information and we would consider paying a cost premium. I think still to Amy's point, it's a bit of a juggle still. They're not willing to say we're going to pay extra point blank, but that's why we want the data. We want the information to be able to say, if you pay an extra $3,000, you're going to save an extra 20% of your emissions, or whatever the case is. And so it's not where I want it to be, but it's becoming more common that the clients are telling us, no, we want to see what this actual information is at the very least.
And clients, I agree with that statement. Clients really like to see the hard data. They like to see the reduction versus cost. So being able to present a graphic to the client, this is the savings you're going to get, just is very, very helpful and very valuable.
And I just want to jump in with a few thoughts on this too. You know, I would say there are probably many folks in the same position as we are, and you know, we're not on the bleeding edge. But I'd like to think the fact that we're engaging with this is that we're, you know, part of a subsect of developers that you know, are thinking about it, leading in some way, and we're still definitely in that realm where we don't know enough about what the costs will be, what the returns will be about our own projects to be coming out with strong commitments, but we're in that learning phase. And I think, you know, the combination of us learning via our projects and information getting better, we're going to move in the right direction. I think embodied carbon is an interesting one because with many sustainability initiatives, it's hard to put a dollar value on it. With embodied carbon, we already have, you know, dollar per ton is something that we think about. You know, it's in the lingo, and we have, you know, different organizations will have different dollar per tons, you know, more on the operational side, but we have that number out there. So, you know, it's not going to be as tricky to start translating this stuff into, you know, dollars from tons. So that will be interesting to see how that kind of influences the conversation. And the last thing I was going to note is, you know, Alberta's in kind of an interesting position because in Alberta, the trade-offs between operational and embodied carbon, it's a real question. We have a really high intensity grid, both on the heating and natural gas side and electricity right now. So we have an interesting conversation to have there. It's going to be different from project to project what the decision making are. I think we're going to see some interesting developments come out of those really low intensity grids of the BCs, the Quebecs, the Manitobas, because for them the conversation is quite a bit simpler. You know, their operational footprint is really small. You know, that kind of out the picture. So the big moves they can make will be on the embodied side. So if you're in Alberta, don't forget that there's the operational side as well. And we can keep our eyes open to other jurisdictions where they're going to face, I think, even more pressure because embodied carbon will be the big thing they can do to tackle emissions from a whole life cycle perspective.
Out of one more comment on the cost conversation. The other thing that we see is that everybody assumes that the more sustainable thing is going to cost more. And because we don't have the data to prove otherwise, we have been ignoring it. And so I think the question we've been asking in terms of how can you reduce the amount of carbon or what's the lower carbon option, at least opens the door to have that conversation, whereas before we just kind of closed it without even bothering to knock. So.
Thanks. The next question is from Travis. And Travis, thank you for all the thoughtful questions and comments you've directed to the panel. This one I'll direct it to everyone that wants to answer. I'd love to hear comments or thoughts around Vancouver's recent vote to require life cycle assessments to be performed for all new building permit approvals and following their process for bringing this forward. There will also be a cap based on the baselines that were determined in a study from 2018. I understand it's a different municipality with different challenges, but there could be some great lessons there.
I could probably answer that one because coming from Vancouver, I think it's absolutely fantastic what the City of Vancouver are doing. I think they're really leading the way in terms of embodied carbon reductions. life cycle assessment is something I think that should be done on all projects. Even if a project is not focusing on embodied carbon reduction, the life cycle, quantifying the embodied carbon can still be valuable, because it means that we can start working out what our baselines would be for different building typologies, different building material uses, different building types. And, you know, what I like to think embodied carbon will be in 10 or 20 years time is the same as operational carbon. We've got a set CO2, kilograms of CO2 per meter squared for different building types, and we're trying to reduce from a number, not just creating our own imaginary baseline buildings. And I think that's what the City of Vancouver is advocating for as well. And I think it's been a long time coming, writing into policy frameworks those embodied carbon reductions are required. I think the industry needs that push, so that we can start incentivizing the industry to produce decent EPDs, and provide us with great data. And I think it's something that all provinces and cities should start to require in the future.
Yeah, I think I basically echo what Amy said, and feel that there's a lot of other municipalities who are using Vancouver as an example starting point. And so I think that's really great that we can take the lessons from someone else and go to where they are, instead of having to try and create the lessons on our own. So I'm hopeful that Adam is talking to Patrick and Wright a lot, and they're learning a lot from each other too.
I just wanted to mention that, you know, this has to be done. To have fast change, you know, we do need the government, you know, push to do this, either at the, you know, state or local, you know, however it may be, city level. You know, we need this. This is how we're going to get change, and this is how we're going to get it faster.
I think we have time for one last question. And again, I'll open it up to the entire panel. It's from someone anonymous. I work for a construction material supplier, and in my experience, I found that scheduled changes to projects can have significant impacts to products being used and installed and the embodied carbon within them. I don't know if this is a problem is realized among owners and designers. For example, a project may start out fine with a projected embodied carbon, and then it gets behind on the construction schedule, and the low carbon products go out the window in favor of products that can be installed faster or sooner. I do not have a solution. I just wanted to mention to the group for discussion.
I think that's a really valid point, and it's no clearer to me on the concrete side. When we need strengths to set by a certain number of days before we can strip the formwork, we need more cementitious material, which is the biggest piece of the emissions pie when you're talking about concrete. And so if we can adjust our scheduling or look at that in a different way, we can look to reduce a lot of emissions through the concrete. But I don't think we have been putting those connections together yet to say this is what it's going to cost, and especially in terms of cost. This is what's going to cost you to extend the schedule by X amount of time in order to reduce that cementitious value. But I'm sure it's true with a lot of other materials too, and the ways they get installed and all sorts of stuff. So I think that's a really good point.
Anyone else?
I could add to that. I think that working for an architecture firm, as architects, we often go to the contractor to advise us on the risk of the construction schedule increasing, using concrete as an example again, and then maybe we can fold that risk into the costing and into the specifications, and that will stop another product from being used if we do go into that. I guess we've got a contingency plan. If the whole design team is working together all the way through from the client to the, you know, the structural and the architect, the structural engineer and the architect and the contractor, if we're all having conversations from very early on in design, these things can be folded into costing from a very early stage. We can have a contingency plan put in place, and that will stop everything going out the window during the construction phase.
And it looks like we still have some time. Stacy, are you able to answer the last question from Aaron? Is there a push for R&D to look into more biomaterial alternatives for future products?
So what we're focusing on is really how to reduce energy in the whole manufacturing process. You know, we reduce water, we reduce energy. And right now, as most people know, there's no way to offset those scope 1 emissions, you know, the natural gas that's used during manufacturing. So, you know, trying to actually reduce the energy, whether it's by reformulation, which we have been looking at, or, you know, I guess we're trying to actually wait for some type of breakthrough technology to emerge, but you know, it's very difficult. But you know, most of what's used for USG products is inorganic. You know, we have paper, and but the gypsum and the mineral wool they're inorganic. So what we're trying to focus on is actually just reducing water, and reducing weight in products, which will reduce energy.
I think maybe I just throw one comment on there. You know, I think one of the added benefits that, you know, life cycle assessments and having environmental product declarations and that information available is that I think it helps people better understand and quantify the benefits, I guess, of bio-based materials as the example that you've given there, and just to understand when there are potentially hidden trade-offs. You know, a bio-based material is not always guaranteed to be much better, and you know, the comprehensive approach that life cycle assessment takes to looking at kind of the big picture will help us incorporate those types of materials when it makes sense, and maybe steer clear if they seem to be the right idea, but you know, they're actually really energy intensive to process or something along those lines. So I think some of the small stumbles that the sustainability movement has had in the past has been from a lack of that comprehensive look. And I think the nice thing is through LCA, through life cycle assessment, we have a rigorous, robust tool to see the big picture, and ultimately drive towards the right answers.
Thanks. So before we end, I'll pass it on to Kristen.
Sorry, hopefully everyone can hear me and see the screen I'm sharing. Thank you so much to everyone for attending, and thank you to all our panelists. I really, really appreciate your time and Stephanie's excellent moderation skills. So a fantastic job, and we've got really great feedback already. Really loving all the questions, and this panel style seems to work really well. We're doing another panel coming up right away on June 16th, so please mark it in your calendars. This one's back at the 4 p.m. time. And we're really excited to have Adam from the Concrete Association of Canada, as well as a variety of other panelists, again, really focusing on that supply chain of concrete all the way through for a building. So our next topic will be kind of more of the same following, but very specific to concrete. So important, as Jolene mentioned, to the entire embodied carbon of the building. So thank you, everyone. And I think we're well on time. So we did really well. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.